Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. This is Angus from the Research Division of the Muse Fabrica. Today, the Muse Fabrica and Euromonitor International are delighted to discuss the impact of COVID-19 and innovation opportunities for apparel and fashion. In the first part of the discussion, Euromonitor International will be sharing with us the impact of the COVID-19 in production, distribution, and consumption for apparel and fashion. And in the second part, the Muse Fabrica will be talking about some of the innovations in supply chain and retail that help address some of the most pressing issues in the industry. Right now, let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Jorge Martin, Global Head of Fashion Research at Euromonitor International. Jorge.
Hello, Angus. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending from where you are joining this session. So yeah, my name is Jorge Martin. I work at Euromonitor International for the last 12 years. I'm in charge of the research and the analysis that we publish on fashion industries. And it's a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for having me.
We also have Alexander Chen, co-director of the Muse Fabrica. Alex.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So for those of you who might not be aware, Muse Fabrica is an innovation and investment platform for the textile space. And we're excited to be hosting this webinar today with Euromonitor.
So yeah, I'm going to start just sharing a few data points from the many pieces of analysis that we've been doing here at Euromonitor pretty much since February, when things started to develop in China. For those of you who don't know who we are or what we do, let me introduce very briefly ourselves, Euromonitor International. We are a practical and strategical provider of business information, of market research, and we work with many companies around the world. We've got 15 offices at the moment all over the world, where we work with business of all sorts. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to use data from Passport, which is an online platform that many of our clients access. This is what you can see on the screen at the moment. We work as well with different clients on an ad hoc basis through our consulting arm. And as I said, from end of February, beginning of March, more or less, we've been helping many of our clients to, first of all, understand what's going on in terms of impact of COVID-19 and helping them to prepare for the massive impact and the transformation that the industry is going through. An impact and a transformation that, unlike a previous crisis, this specific one, COVID-19, is having an impact across the board, not only in terms of the consumption, as we saw, for example, back in 2009, 2010, during the financial crisis, where we saw a strong dip of consumption, but as well as part of the retail and the logistics as a result of all the issues that companies are having to transport stock all over the world, and as well in terms of manufacturing, with many factories around the world stopping production at different stages, and when returning, not capable to fully function at full capacity, given the limitations of social distancing in many of these. So what I'm going to do over the next 10-15 minutes is to show you some data, just to have a sense of what the impact has been across each of these. So let's start with consumption. According to the latest data that we've published in July, our latest update for apparel and footwear, we are estimating decline for the global sales of around 15% for the full year for 2020. We are working here at Euromonitor with different scenarios, looking at different possibilities in terms of how the pandemic is evolving and what are the chances of second waves of infection that we've seen in some markets already starting to develop. So the decline that we are expecting for 2020 is around 15 to 20%, depending on the severity of that impact of those different scenarios. Just to put it into context, this decline is 3 times bigger than all the decline that the industry witnessed between 2008-9, when the financial crisis started, and the end of the financial crisis in many markets around 2011, 2012. So in just a few months, the industry is trying to cope with an impact that is never seen before in terms of the reduction of that consumption. Reduction that is in a very first step as a result of the limitations in terms of retail, apparel and footwear specialty retailers, department stores, and all sorts of different physical retailers have been closed for many weeks in many markets. And unfortunately, unlike what many people in the industry were expecting, those that have been reopened are operating at a very low capacity because of social distancing, because of the limitations imposed in terms of the number of how many people can be at the store at any given point, but also as well from the very, very frugal approach to consumption that many consumers are having at the moment, considering unemployment, furloughs, and the really gloomy scenario in terms of economic and financial situation and disposable income for many consumers across most markets. It's surprising, but some categories and some markets are actually already starting to rebound quite quickly. I'm going to share some data at the end of this section looking at the recovery. But even though the decline is across the board for menswear, for women's wear, for children's wear, and pretty much across all categories, what we've seen is certain specific products, certain specific categories like leisure wear or active wear, comfort wear, clothing that people is using at home, comfortable and affordable, especially, that is seems to be facing the crisis in a much better position. So in terms of consumption, and this is global data, but it reflects pretty well, pretty much most countries around the world, a very drastic reduction for 2020. In fact, is the second biggest decline that we've got in Euromonitor in terms of different industries as a result of COVID-19, along with luxury goods and along with personal accessories. Apparel and footwear is one of the worst performing fast mover consumer goods industries that we research. So as I said before, this impact is not only affecting consumption, it's been affecting massively distribution in the beginning, as I said, because of the lockdown, because of the closure of non-essential businesses around the world. Even though many players, Inditex was releasing results this week about second quarter of the year with, I think, 74% increase of e-commerce, even though e-commerce has, in a way, not really replaced, but helped to slow down a little bit that decline. Most of the clothes and the footwear these days, most of fashion is still sold through physical retailers, and that's the reason why still the industry is in negative territory for 2020. But something interesting that we can see when we look at the performance of the different channels across different industries indicates where the industry is going. In a way, most of the big players are celebrating the success of e-commerce, something that for some medium-sized and smaller players has been a bit of a problem as well, because they were unable to cope with such a quick and massive demand for clothing and footwear through e-commerce. But the other type of channels that we've seen that are performing particularly well are the discounters. So this gives us some clues already of where the industry might be looking at when it comes to the recovery. The convenience of e-commerce, and the value for money propositions of, I'm looking and I'm sharing here data from discounters, but within the context of fashion, I'm thinking about off-price retailers, for example, and even normal retailers that are pushing a lot of stock with very heavy discounting. So value for money formats and e-commerce are likely to perform particularly well over the next few months, and most probably as well during 2021. And last but not least, manufacturing. The crisis has exposed something that it was already discussed in the past. Actually, if you think about consumption, but if you think about distribution as well, what's going on in the industry today in terms of the impact and the starting point of recovery where many brands are at the moment is not something brand new. A lot of these trends, a lot of these discussions and strategic priorities that many brands are thinking about are not completely brand new. A lot of the big players in the world have been discussing and rethinking and trying to reassess if, from a consumption point of view, if it makes sense to have countries like the US, for example. I can think of some of the most developed markets with the average consumer there buying 60 pieces of clothing and footwear per year. And what does it mean in terms of sustainability? What does it mean in terms of manufacturing capacity? In terms of distribution as well, the industry has been thinking and planning around e-commerce and digital sales for quite a few years now. And in terms of manufacturing, as you can see on the screen now, what I'm showing here is the key markets in terms of production. And what you can see straight away is the over-dependence on China. So from a manufacturing point of view as well, many of the big players at least have been rethinking and looking at what does it mean, this overdependence, how risky it is, what is the impact in terms of the labor cost. And COVID-19 has exposed all these limitations in a really quick manner. So there's loads of discussions at the moment from all the big players, and many of the conversations that we are having with our clients goes on those lines, looking at, okay, how can we make a more diversified supply chain? How can we reshore some of this manufacturing? What is the role of automation and robotics so we can make it a bit less labor intensive? But it's definitely the chain of the value chain that it's more, is the weakest, is the more labor intensive, and it's unfortunately in countries where there's no much protection for workers on the industry. So it's probably the more dramatic from a humanitarian point of view, not only from a business point of view. We've got here from India, particularly this quote from the Apparel Export Promotion Council chairman, discussing how all these closures, what they're having as a result is big amount of cancellations and postponing orders, and big players asking for hefty discounts that in many cases, many of these producers cannot actually afford. So in summary, a really strong impact felt throughout the value chain pretty much since the beginning of the year. Now, I don't want to close on a gloomy and negative note. There seems to be light at the end of the tunnel. In fact, some countries, some big countries, actually like China in particular, are starting to show very strong rebound and healthy growth. So what we are expecting on a global scale for 2021 is that big rebound. Of course, it depends a lot on how the situation evolves in big markets, particularly in Western Europe and in the US, which have a massive impact on global sales. It seems, at least in this part of the world, that even though the second wave is a reality, government seems to be way more hesitant to go into full lockdowns, which is still allowing retail to carry on functioning in most markets. So if the situation evolves as many people is expecting, with a certain amount of the population already with vaccines by next year, what we expect to see is a strong rebound, even though it will take still a few years for the industry to recover all the revenue loss during the first few months of 2020. Now, what's next? Well, the industry is looking at innovation across manufacturing, distribution, innovation also as well in terms of how people is consuming fashion. So I'm going to pass it on now to Angus and Alex, that, if I'm not mistaken, they will be sharing some of these examples. Back to you guys. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jorge, for that. So, Jorge, you covered a bit about some of the impacts that we have seen in the apparel and textiles value chain. What we would share next is the flip side of that. That's some of the innovation opportunities that has arisen in the past few months. So first off, right, on the next slide, this has been a super strange year, huge impacts, but taking a step back in the context of things, this is not something that is new. We have actually encountered worse pandemics historically, most notably Black Death in the 1400s. And on the next slide, what we also see is that looking back at some of these historical pandemics, crisis can actually create opportunities for change. So in the aftermath of the Black Death, Politico published this great article recently about how the American economy or America's system can actually benefit from COVID-19. And the references, right after Black Death, there's an Italian Renaissance with the change in social systems and openness to new talent and innovation that made Florence really the premium city and capital in Europe for scientific creativity. So on the next slide, as you look at COVID-19, some of the impacts that Jorge has mentioned, obviously supply chain has been disrupted. We have breakage in some of the raw materials. We have orders cancellation resulting in factory closures. At the same time, retail has slowed down tremendously, building up of inventory and even bankruptcies in some case. But what we also believe is that there are potential opportunities. So on the next slide, we line out sort of like 4 different innovation opportunities for recovery. Like Jorge mentioned, innovation-led kind of opportunities. One is really the demand and the need to build more resilience into supply chains, be it localizing some of the materials of production or digitizing some parts of the production. The second part of it really is in retail. Are there ways to actually better manage inventory or enhance customer experience? And beyond that, the wider ecosystem, be it your own internal employees, care for employees, retraining, or managing sort of supply chain, supplier brand kind of relationships, and really sort of rebuilding the whole ecosystem. So today we'd like to share a bit more about some of the examples that we've seen ahead. So I'll pass on time to Angus to share more.
Thank you, Alex. The COVID-19 pandemic has indeed brought some serious impact and challenges to us. But at the same time, we do see some innovation trends arising. And a number of startups are helping to drive these innovations. And the COVID-19 situation has accelerated some of these trends, especially for supply chain and retail. We have seen 3 important innovation trends in supply chain. First, localized materials, which refers to the use of material technology to develop alternative materials in order to produce locally. And second, the digitization of production to bolster the overall supply chain capabilities. And we also see localized production or nearshoring, where more companies are now considering to move their production back to home or neighboring regions by using automation and on-demand production technologies. more companies are now using alternative materials to produce products. And the importance of using localized materials is highlighted, especially during the pandemic, where many companies are not able to source important raw materials for production. For example, we have seen Adidas. They have made use of recycled fabrics from plastic to launch a reusable and breathable face mask to help those who exercise. There's also a recycled fabric from used garment. For example, a Sweden-based startup called Renewcell. They are doing something amazing, that they turn used garments with high cellulosic content, such as cotton, into biodegradable raw materials to continue to make clothes. So in this way, they are promoting a circular economy that is beneficial to the environment as well. And digitization is helping boost the efficiency and transparency for the supply chain. We see that the digital sampling technology is improving every day. And recently, Brandsware, a startup, has partnered with Adobe to enable designers to create even more hyper-realistic 3D designs. And that's also blockchain technology. We know that LVMH Group was one of the earliest companies to adopt this technology to ensure the authenticity of its luxury products. And recently, one of its brands, Bulgari, also used the blockchain technology to track the journey of the donations to a virus-free fund it has recently launched to help those affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are seeing more applications with the blockchain technology during this time that helps boost the overall transparency. And also, more companies are now considering moving their production back to their local markets because of some geopolitical risk or another supply chain risk. And to do so, they rely on automation technology. For example, recently Gap has used more AI-powered robots to help automate the process in its distribution centers in order to cope with increasing online orders, and at the same time to help keep a safe social distance between employees. And also on-demand production technology, which refers to made-as-order production method, is also helpful for localized production. For example, there's a startup called Untitled. They have been focusing on building custom jeans through automated and localized manufacturing. Similarly, we see innovative trends in retail, including new ways to help optimize inventory management, as well as the digitization of retail. More brands and retailers are considering to optimize their inventory management, and this can be done both before and after the customer journey. For pre-consumer journey, we may consider the use of predictive analytics. Chain of Demand is a startup that uses AI-based predictive analytics to help grasp the customer demand in advance. So as to help brands and retailers to minimize some unsold inventory. And for the post-consumer part, we also see the emergence of some resale marketplace. For example, there's a startup called Reflaunt. They are a keen believer in circular economy, and they are connecting brands, retailers with the second-hand market. Customers can directly sell their used products from the brand's website under the help of Reflaunt. And then they can earn some shopping credits as well that can help encourage them to continue to shop with the brands. So they are trying to connect the used products to the connecting to the brands and retailers to the second-hand markets to better promote an overall circular economy. And undoubtedly, we see there is an increasing digitization efforts of retail during the pandemic. For example, to respond to the lockdown situation, Daiso has launched a digital showroom to allow customers to view its products online. And when gyms closed during this time, Nike open up its training club app to allow more customers to work out virtually. And we also see something interesting called conversational commerce. A startup called Hero is helping its brand partners to sell face-to-face to the customers through online chats and video calls, so that if the customers would like to check the products closely at the store, they can use this technology for help. So we definitely see more innovation examples in supply chain and retail during this pandemic that showcases how COVID-19 has accelerated some of these innovation trends for apparel and fashion. And right now, I will pass back to Alex to give us a few more questions to consider for the road ahead.
To conclude today before I open up for questions, right? We believe that when thinking about innovation opportunities, there are really three questions for us to consider. The first is, in terms of innovations for sustainability, has COVID-19 actually accelerated or hindered sustainability's agenda? So part of it, you see benefits, right? Certain brands have gone seasonless during this time. There have been a rising interest in more higher quality, better products, but at the same time, many brands are now focused on survival. There might be less incentive or capital to invest for the longer term. And there's also been actually increased usage in disposables or plastic products during this period because of health concerns. So one question really is, would COVID-19 actually help accelerate sustainability trends in the longer term? The second question on the next slide really examines, some of the changes that have happened. How much of these is actually short-term adjustments versus longer-term structural changes? So, for example, production-wise, are traditional ways of production gone for good? Things like trade shows, fashion cycles, for example, and retail as well, right? There has been a strong growth in e-commerce, but offline retail still takes up a majority share of sales. How much of this is actually a short-term change versus really reshaping retail in the long term? And what would an omni-channel future of retail look like? And most importantly, the final question, thinking about sort of short-term and the future. A lot of innovation opportunities have arisen, but some of these would take a longer time than others. You have things that can be implemented right away, typically soft tech like software related, while the deeper tech things like new materials automation would take time to come in picture and would have challenges as well. Thinking about what the now versus future would be crucial. So finally, in some, we started off by talking about past pandemics, and we want to end on the same note, right? If you look back historically at the past crisis, almost every crisis have produced some of the world's most innovative and largest companies. And our optimistic belief is that if past crisis has created opportunity, can the current one do so as well? So in some, we are delighted to have shared a bit more of that today. If you're interested in more information, welcome to read more on our website. But that aside, I'm super excited to get the discussion and questions from the floor going right now. So Angus, back to you.
Thank you, Alex. Now is the Q&A session, and a reminder, you can type in your questions in the chat button as shown in this image, or email your questions to us. So we are now waiting a bit to see the questions coming. So we have the first question. What we are talking about today is more on a global outlook, the global situations. What do you think are some of the regional challenge, for example, specific to Europe, UK, or USA, for retail and apparel and fashion? What are some of the regional challenge for this market?
I'll pick up this one probably because we've got some data for these regions, definitely in all of these markets in these regions. Europe, UK, and US, I mean, they're very similar in a way. They're mostly highly developed markets with a very big per capita consumption in terms of volume, with pretty much the same brands available across all the markets. the main challenge at the moment is the evolution of the pandemic. It looks like in Europe and in the UK and in the US is very similar as well. It's number of infections are growing, specific lockdowns in certain cities or neighborhoods or regions in different markets or states in the case of the US. But the situation is changing literally on a daily basis. So the challenge at the moment is how governments are really going to control those waves, how likely is that retail will remain open. It seems like most brands have managed now to make fully operational their e-commerce operations, and people is happy to jump into the e-commerce whenever they cannot go to the stores or whenever they don't want to the stores. So I think the challenges are very similar across the regions. Situation is different from market to market. Even here in Europe, we've got countries like Italy, Spain, that were heavily affected in the beginning, and Italy seems to be in a better place at the moment compared to Spain. And Germany doing way better than anybody else in terms of the number of infections, and different markets are doing very different things when it comes to the reopening. So there's a lot of impact in this case from legislation, I would say. And then I'm thinking in terms of next year, in terms of the recovery, is going to be down to how big the impact in terms of the economy for these specific markets, in terms of the unemployment. Some of the projections that we've got for GDP and for unemployment are really, really high in some of these markets. As usual, Southern European markets suffering the most. So with a big amount of the population potentially unemployed or on furlough or under some sort of government scheme to support basic needs, the recovery is going to be quite different from market to market, I would say, based on those two things. Disposable income from a purely economic point of view, and a specific legislation from market to market.
Yes, and thank you for telling us more about the Europe situation. And as we know, more international brands are now closing the physical stores in China or readjusting their strategy. Even though they're closing the physical stores, more of them are going online to think about the digitization strategy for the China market, especially when we know that the Chinese consumers are now the major buyer of the luxury products, luxury fashions nowadays. So it's really important for us to think about how we can, if international brands are going to enter into China market or expand there, localized and our digitization strategy will be very relevant for the China market.
So if I understood correctly the question, are you asking in terms of how important the digital strategy it is for China?
Yes. Yeah, I'm trying to adding another perspective for the local regional challenges for the China market if international brands want to continue to expand there during this difficult time.
Yeah, it's been it's really interesting because a lot of first of all, a lot of global brands, they don't really understand the cultural aspect of operating in China, and there's been completely unintentional, but sometimes very wrong doings of certain brands, not really understanding how the Chinese consumer operates. It's a country with the highest penetration of e-commerce. So a digital strategy is a given. You cannot really operate there without a proper digital strategy. The problem many brands are having is that they don't really they are trying to replicate what works from a digital point of view in Western Europe or in the US or in Japan, when the ecosystem that the consumer has there with, WeChat and different platforms is completely different.
Yeah, another question is about sustainable fashion. Do you think it is still important in the market in the short term or long term? Or even do you think there will be increased consumer interest to smaller, locally produced brands? I think the questions here are about how the COVID-19 situation is going to affect the retail of fashion and apparel. Will we see more people to buy locally and from sustainable brands?
I've got mixed feelings about this, being completely honest, because I think a lot of the big brands are trying to claim that, this is probably a bit in a very over-optimistic way, that this is probably a good thing for the sustainability agenda, that because people is buying less and people has more time to, people working from home and going out less and staying more indoors, reassess, do I need that many clothes? Do I really have to buy so many pieces of clothing per year? I'm a bit more skeptical, to be completely honest. I think if we look at what the consumer behavior in terms of crisis, and when the disposable income is really, really squeezed, I think they are going to jump into the really value for money propositions, back again to fast fashion, to ultra fast fashion and super cheap producers, that because this is what they can afford at that point. I think, the awareness around the impact of that and the sustainability is increasingly important. But in terms of crisis, the disposable income and the affordability of the product, I think still remains, the pure pricing remains a priority. So short midterm, I think is likely to take a bit of a backseat in consumers' mind, potentially even in terms of the strategy of some of the big brands, because to go really fully sustainable, there's a lot that they need to change in terms of the business model, in terms of the way they produce, design, distribute, and the whole business model built around relentless consumption and volume. And that takes years. That takes a lot of education as well, I guess, for consumers to really convince consumers that is better to have less number of items on their wardrobes, but of a better quality, better produced, more ethically produced, rather than discharging clothes like there's no tomorrow on a year in, year out. So I think it's probably something more of a longer term trend.
I think definitely agree with that. To Jorge's point, like consumers are now searching more for things with value, and also the fact that we have been on lockdown for most of this year. People are buying new clothes. They aren't buying it to go out. They are buying clothes that are comfortable, loungewear that can be at home. So there's definitely a shift in the kind of demand and value proposition that they're looking for. But that said, precisely because of that shift as well, if you are a new brand, or if for the large brands thinking about products to launch, like there's an opportunity in having brands that can speak to that value for money, and also having brands that can speak to that change in consumption. The other thing with regards to sustainability, much of the world has shifted towards more ethical consumption. But the reality, like Jorge mentioned, is that consumers need to also see what's in it for them. So you look at the meat movement in the US, a huge reason why plant-based meat has increased is because the actual meat supply chain has broken down, rather than people wanting to be more sustainable per se. So In the same way, when you look at fashion, some surveys done in the past have shown that consumers are interested in buying sustainability because it's something that they can perceive to be cool. It's cool to be part of that movement. So to actually push sustainability forward, part of it is really on brands to be able to tell compelling stories that are genuine, authentic, but also truly identify consumers, whether you're a small brand or a large brand. Getting that out longer term would really be combining that value for money with quality, but also the right sort of storytelling.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's that bit about the authenticity that you are talking about. Even going back to the second bit of the question, Angus, about the smaller brands, the niche brands that I can see on the chat, some questions about it. It's something really interesting. I'm really excited about that, and this is something that we are discussing with some of our clients, is the whole working from home and the impact that is having on the city center of most cities, with thinking a little bit, let's say next year or the next few years, if working remotely really keep developing and there is a growing amount of people that is working from home, retail in a way needs to reassess the whole flagship store in Super Mall in Causeway Bay in Hong Kong or in Oxford Street in London, and start thinking about, okay, consumers are now spending way more time in the suburbs. So who is in the suburbs, because it's way cheaper in terms of rent and so on, are many of these smaller brands, independent people that, they don't have the means to open a super massive flagship store in the city center or in a really highly priced commercial in terms of real estate area in any given city, but they are already operating in the suburbs in more residential areas. And that is something that we've seen, that the benefits of people spending more time at home in those type of businesses, not only in fashion, but across, food service and packaged food, and even in entertainment and leisure and so on. So I think with fashion can be a good thing for all these smaller brands as well, because if you are buying locally and buying closer to home for all your needs, and you're spending way less time commuting, going to commercial areas, that potentially can have a really good boost for all of these small niche brands, many of which are really operating on this more ethical, sustainable positioning. So that's going to be a good thing, a good factor helping this type of brands.
Yeah, thank you. So we will take one final question, because we have talked a bit. We have talked pretty much on the retail side. So this one will be a bit about the supply chain. So companies are now diversifying their manufacturing base away from China. So which locations do you think will be the winners?
I think they are probably not yet, generally speaking, moving away from China yet. It's not that easy to move manufacturing from one day to another, especially now given the circumstances where it's not easy to operate businesses pretty much anywhere. There's been a lot of attention in terms of Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of markets in Africa that, because of the labor costs, represent some potential. Ethiopia and Kenya and many other markets in Sub-Saharan Africa. Closer to China, the usual big hubs already, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, even in Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. So there's many that are well placed to carry on absorbing, because it's not sudden thing. This has been going on for over the last few years. So it's a mix, really, Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan African markets.
I think to quickly supplement on that as well. So China, obviously biggest production base right now globally, like Jorge mentioned, but the other sort of like three top countries are sort of like Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam. And if you look even for China's now, their largest trading partner this year is actually the ASEAN bloc, not any place else. So we believe that there will be a shift in production to those countries. At the same time, what it also means is that those countries would embark on a similar move as China did. So they'll focus very much on low cost of production, but it also gives production in China a chance to be actually upvalued, to focus more on automation, on innovation, and to be more sustainable as well. We're already seeing that with some of like Hong Kong's largest manufacturers like Apparel, Crystal. They are kind of new facilities in China are much more high tech than some of those you see in the other countries. So that's one point. The other point is that if you look at top 10 production base for apparel and textiles, some of the countries in the top 10 are actually European countries. So Italy and Turkey still features very much in that. And part of the reason is that they're known for producing higher quality kind of fabrics. And in the questions thread, there's a lot of questions about recycling. There's a lot of questions about cost of production. One opportunity, again, is that for recycling to work, it needs to be localized. You need to have the right infrastructure and technologies for collection and sorting. But it also creates opportunities for some of these traditional European countries with the right recycling infrastructure and collection. You can actually help promote reshoring on that front as well. And we're seeing that with actual examples. Renewcell, one of our sort of innovator from Sweden, have launched products with H&M and Levi's this year. Everything is produced locally in Sweden, collected and then produced locally in Sweden. So that might be some of the trends that we see going forward as well. Yeah, back to you, Angus.
Thank you again for joining this webinar today, and we hope you enjoy.